It's Grandmama. Time for another story from our hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, The Speed Cop. Hello there. This is the day of hot rod drivers when the young fellows think it's pretty waste to go around corners on more than two wheels. It might give you a chuckle to look back at the day the first speed cops of Grays Harbor, when a man could get himself arrested for driving 20 miles an hour through the streets of our city. And in this day and age, when we hop into jalopies and whip across the country from one state to another, or from one coast to another, it might be interesting to recall when one of the first cross-country trips ended in Grays Harbor. Yes, the automobile has come a long way. As fast, but its early start on the harbor was fraught with all the colorful and interest that it provided across the nation. Maybe some of you have forgotten it. So tonight, let's look back to the early days of automobiling. Of course, we pause first for Dick Crombie to put in words from our sponsor, then out with a yarn about Speed Cop Grout and his motorcycle, speeders in Cosmopolis, and Don Hawley's record-breaking drive across the continent. Dick? You do the talking for now. It was long after the first automobiles came to Grays Harbor, years after George Emerson and Frank Lamb began to scare the horses and shoo the chickens off the highways in the vicinity of Hoquiam, and Frank Becker roared into Aberdeen with his new Oldsmobile. Automobiles were in fact an accomplished reality when the day came along that we're going to talk about. People had stopped using such classic quotations as "get a horse" whenever they saw an automobile stalled, and the harbor had some very professional garage services, for it was now 1916 on Grays Harbor. Roscoe Fear was fixing the gasoline buggies in his garage out where the Morick Hotel stands now. Les Polson sold the Dodge Cadillac Maxwell and White cars and trucks over where Whitney's Oldsmobile is now located. C.W. Becker sold the Fords in Hoquiam, and then Stewart was selling cars, and the Mason Acker Auto Company was in Hoquiam. Yes, the gasoline buggy had gotten its wheels firmly on the ground when 1916 came along, and it had brought its share of problems to the cities of the harbor too. Didn't these newfangled gasoline buggies go roaring back and forth between Aberdeen and Hoquiam, raising a cloud of dust along the Pacific Avenue in Aberdeen, endangering the residents of East Hoquiam? Wasn't the boulevard between South Aberdeen and Cosmopolis becoming unsafe for pedestrians? What with cars racing along at 20 or 25 miles an hour? There were complaints from residents on all sides, and the problem sat heavily on the shoulders of the city government. So Warren Eggers and Jim Bowes laid the whole thing out on the Aberdeen Council table one night in early 1916, and Mayor Jim Phillips allowed that something should be done. Chief of Police Bob Schmidt had twice handed it back to the council with a statement that the only cure for the problem was a speed cop for the town. And twice the council had shrugged it off. It meant increasing the police expenditures, and besides, where could you find an officer of the law who could ride a motorcycle well enough to keep up from breaking his own neck while he kept enforcing the law? No, it wasn't a problem to be toyed with. But now they were faced with it, and no mistake, Schmidt had said, "Get me a motorcycle cop or stop talking about it." Well, they had a good long talk that evening and finally decided to authorize the police chief to hire a motorcycle patrolman. That's it. If he could find one and put him to work catching speeders. It was soon after that Chief Schmidt turned up with a likely candidate in the person of one L. Grout, a man who could ride a motorcycle, who had won and who aspired to protect the laws of the citizens, although he was not a resident of the town. And in the summer of 1916, Officer Grout went to work. His uniform was a dusty khaki color. His motorcycle had a speedometer, and it was equipped with a small light to permit it to be read after dark. He wore goggles and a professional motorcyclist-approved headgear of the era, a sort of go from you, come to you cap with ear flaps that could turn down on a cold day. He pinned on a badge, kicked over his 2-cylinder machine, and snorted out of to uphold the law of the town. And it wasn't long before he began to get results. The town, and in fact all towns of the harbor and all motorists, were duly warned to drive with care in Aberdeen or they would get tolls from the law. But there were some who felt that 15 miles an hour was a little too slow in the business district, and others who felt that 20 through the residential district didn't permit a motorist much latitude, and they went faster to their sorrow, for Officer Grout was everywhere. Just when motorists began to recognize the khaki uniform, he changed it. One day he would appear in overalls and the next day in a business suit. He was particularly dangerous for motorists who sped up a few miles when they crossed the long rumbling plank trestle that served as the entrance to Aberdeen from the east. He had hiding places just big enough to take his machine, and he managed to remain out of sight until some careless driver raced past at 25. Then Officer Grout was on him with a roar of his motorbike. Each week, the list of drivers appearing before Judge Glenn Snyder in police court grew larger. And the daily newspaper printed the list of drivers, branding them as speeders. One morning, Grout trapped A.M. Campbell on the trestle in the morning, and a few minutes later nabbed A. Walker over on 2nd Street. He caught Clyde Pitchford exceeding 20 on Heron Street, and James W. Parks, the ex-mayor of Aberdeen, racing over the trestle at 25. Henry Hall was slowed up and tagged on Broadway, and over on Curtis Street, Dan Spiegel and Peter Babbage were driving too fast to suit the ambitious patrolman. The courts were full that week. Pritchard appeared before Judge Snyder and requested a postponement. Attorney Ted Bruner was driving with me, Pritchard said, and he will verify my statement that I was not exceeding 20. Judge Snyder granted the postponement. Ex-Mayor Parks pleaded guilty to exceeding 15, but argued that he was not going 25 as Officer Grout had claimed. In paying his fine, the one-time mayor asked that he not be classed as a speeder. Judge Snyder recognized the former city chief as a careful and conscious driver, then took the $10 fine. Spiegel and Babbage appeared in court with Judge Smith in Cosmopolis, having been in that city when Officer Grout made his arrest. Babbage told the judge that 12 miles an hour was his normal speed, but the unfortunate driver had made a mistake on passing the judge when the adjudicator was en route to court that morning. "You passed me on the boulevard this morning," the judge rasped, and fined the driver the customary amount. And then there was the day that Officer Grout ambushed Joe Renwitz on the trestle east of town. Joe, it was later claimed, was rattling along at a breakneck speed of 45 miles an hour when the law enforcement agent caught him, and Joe took exception to the pinch. He alighted from his vehicle and drove home 2 well-placed haymakers before Grout and his assistant, Harold Johnson. Johnson was riding with a law enforcement arm, learning the techniques, before Grout and Johnson pinned his arms and quieted the driver. And this time, the speeder got $10 for driving faster than the law allowed, and $50 for assaulting a police officer. Of course, emergencies were taken into consideration as the new cop went about his business of slowing up the gasoline buggies. There was the morning early when kindly old Doc C.M.J. Prescott was roaring along at 30 in his Oakland. The boards of the trestle were roaring like thunder as he pushed the accelerator down to the floor. And there, like death and taxes, came Officer Grout in pursuit of the doctor in duty. The doc pleaded that he had an urgent case to attend to. It made no difference, Grout pointed out. He was exceeding the speed limit. He must come to the station. So over his argument protest, the good man of medicine was hustled over to the station where he explained the nature of his speed run to Judge Schneider. Case dismissed, the judge roared, and Dr. Prescott hurried off to make his delayed call. That led to a change in the activities. The medical men exceeding the speed limit in the line of duty were permitted a few extra miles per hour. But by this time, the citizen drivers were getting pretty fed up on the mysterious law enforcer who appeared in various costumes and came out of nowhere to nab them for speeding, if they varied at all from the rigid laws by a single mile an hour. Soon after that, the city made some changes to its law enforcement staff, and Officer Grout was no longer lurking in the shadows waiting for unwary motorists. But the automobile drivers of the city had learned their lesson. Aberdeen, and for that matter all of Grays Harbor, went ahead into its years of automobile with a new respect for the accelerator and a constant awareness that if they stepped on it too hard, there may be an Officer Grout behind the next tree to hail them into court and brand them with the dreaded title of speeder. And now, Dick, suppose you say a word or two from our sponsors while we turn the page and find the story of Don Hawley's transcontinental run. Don Hawley, as old-timers will recall, was a coach of the Aberdeen High School football team that twice won the state championship. That would be enough to immortalize the man. Had he not made an inevitable record as a lieutenant in the First World War and made one of the most historic transcontinental runs ever recorded by the Grays Harbor motorists. It was 1916, and when school was out that June, Coach Don journeyed back to Toledo, Ohio to take delivery of a brand new Willys Overland automobile. Before he left the harbor, he had confided in a few friends that he intended to drive it west, an adventure in those days that could be compared to Columbus setting sail for the New World or the Wright brothers soaring into space at Kitty Hawk. But Coach Don was as good as his word. He took a few practice turns around Toledo in the new car, then filled the tank and started west for his hometown, driving the shortest route, which was through the Dakotas, across Montana the whole distance, on primitive, unpaved, and in many cases unmarked roads. He roared along at what was later computed as 209 miles in every 24 hours. And after 14 days of continuous driving, he had negotiated a distance of 2,920 miles and had arrived in Portland, Oregon. He was hailed there as a pioneer of American motoring, and his picture was taken for the Oregonian, besides his travel-stained overland, and every vital statistic along his journey was recorded on the automobile page of the newspaper. And by the time he had driven the last 200 miles to the home in the harbor, his fame was assured and honors were awaiting for him. He had used 116 gallons of gas, averaged more than 25 miles to the gallon, spent $2 for garage repair work, and fixed one puncture. He had burned a quart of oil every 100 miles, which automobile people noted was extremely economical, and could tell you just about how the roads were in every state between here and Ohio. The town turned out to see the car that had made the amazing record, and when he parked it on the streets in downtown Aberdeen, a small crowd gathered. It was a real automobiling adventure in 1916, and an achievement that should be promoted in a place such as the Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.